Morning, grade 7. Today we're working with multiplication and division equations. I'm going to review decimals. Sorry, I realized in my lesson yesterday I said I was going to review decimals and I didn't, so I thought I'd just throw that into this lesson as a general review. Then I'll review algebra in general, working with multiplication and division, and then we'll get into algebra with fractions, which is the main focus of our lesson. All right, so here we have some decimal review. So we have 3.2 times 2.4. So this is just a generalized review because you're going to be using it throughout the rest of this unit. When you are multiplying with decimals, it does not matter if you line up the decimals or not. In this case, they happen to line up because we're only working with tenths, but it doesn't matter if they line up or not. That only matters for addition or subtraction. So what I can do is I can think to myself, I'm going to move the decimal out of the way, and I'm going to move the decimal out of the way. So I moved it over once, and I moved it over once here. Then I just do regular multiplication. So I do 2 times 4 is 8, 3 times 4 is 12, place is 0, 2 times 2 is 4, 2 times 3 is 6. I can add it together, and I get 768. Now, whenever you work with decimals, you have to remember to move the decimals back in. So we've moved them out of the way here so that we can just work with it regularly, and now we need to move them back in. So we move them in once, twice. If you're not sure if you've moved the decimal to the correct spot, what you can always do is you can always estimate. So you can think over here, well, 3.2 is like 3, and 2.4 is like 2. 3 times 2 is 6. Now, of course, 6 is not quite the same as 7.68, but we know that it's close enough. Okay, if I ended up with the number 76.8, then I would know that I have done something wrong. So that's just a review of multiplying with decimals. All right, now let's do a little bit of review with algebra. We're throwing in some negative integers there. So we have negative 4x equals 240. Remember, you can think of x as like a box of candies where we don't know what's inside of them. Okay, we want to find what is x. The way to figure out what is x is to get x all by itself. So the first thing you do is you ask yourself, what is happening to x? Well, what's happening is it's being multiplied by 4. In order to get x by itself, we do the opposite. So the opposite of multiplying by negative 4 is that we divide by 4, negative 4. Remember the rule, in order to keep an equation, you have to be equal, you have to be fair. So what you do to one side, you must do to the other. Again, don't forget that negative. It will really change your answer if you don't have the negative. Negative 4 divided by negative 4 cancels out. So I end up with x all by itself, which of course is the goal. I want to know what x is. X equals 240 divided by negative 4. If you want, you can do long division over here. If you can't do it in your head, number on the top goes in the box. But you should be able to, in your mind, cover up the 0 and think, how many times does 4 fit into 24? It fits in, oopsies, sorry, let me change back to my pen. It fits in 6 times, then we add the 0. Now we think to ourselves, we have a positive number and we have a negative number. A positive divided by a negative, it's opposite signs, so I end up with negative 60 as my answer. If you want to check mentally in your head, you can always go back to our original question over here. You can think, does it make sense for negative 4 times negative 60 to equal 240? That's how you can check. All right, let's do a little bit more review. Let's work with when we start with m being divided by something. So here we have m divided by negative 2. So again, the opposite. So first you start with what you have. That never changes. This is what I have. M divided by negative 2. The opposite is to multiply by negative 2. Equals negative 40, which you do to one side, you must do to the other, times negative 2. Okay, so make sure that new thing happens to both sides in order to be fair. Then this crosses out, because if I do m times 2 divided by 2, I get m all by itself. M equals And I think to myself, what's 40 times 2? It's 80. Now let me think. Does it need to be positive or negative? Well, I have a negative times another negative. They're the same signs, so I get a positive answer. Again, you can go back over here, and in your mind you can say, well, what happens if I put 80 over here? What's 80 divided by negative 2? Well, 80 divided by 2 is 40. And over here, I have a positive and I have a negative. So a positive divided by a negative does indeed get me a negative over here. So that's what we've been doing already since Unit 5. Now we're going to make it a little bit more interesting by throwing fractions into the equation. So the same steps apply. We're not going to change the steps. It just gets a little bit more messy because we're working with fractions. So over here, we have 4/7 times m. So the same steps apply. I'm going to think to myself, well, if I have 4/7 times m, how do I get m by itself? Well, the answer is to divide by 4/7. Now, what I do to one side, I must do to the other. Now, you could, if you wanted to, so I'm writing out what I originally have, write it like this, divided by 4/7. But that might not be a way that you're used to or familiar with. So what you can do instead is you can just write the regular divided by symbol here, divided by 4/7. It's up to you. I personally prefer this way because I think it makes it a little bit more straightforward. These guys cancel out. 4/7 divided by 4/7 is 1, so m stays all by itself. Now, we need to just go back to our lesson that we did the other day. How do I divide with fractions? Well, the answer is we multiply by the reciprocal. So again, I change from division to multiplication, and I change my 4/7 to the reciprocal. Okay? Now, if I want, I can cross cancel. Again, grade 7, you don't have to, but it does make your numbers easier in the end. So I'm going to cross cancel. I'm going to divide by 7 on the top and on the bottom over here. So I get -3 times 1. So I get -3. And then I get 2 times 4, and I get -3/8. You'll notice I forgot to highlight up here. This is question 13 out of your book. So I'm picking exact questions out of your book so you have examples of how to do them. All right, let's do another one. Now we have m divided by -12 equals 1 1/2. So same thing, get m all by itself. So it's being divided by 12. What's the opposite? The opposite is multiply by -12. Okay, what you do to one side, you must do to the other. Now I'm going to combine two steps into one because I know when I work with multiplying fractions, I can't leave my mixed number that way. I need to make it an improper fraction. So I'm going to go 2 times 1 is 2 plus 1 is 3. So I get 3/2. And then my new thing that happened over here, I need to do on this side. Multiply by -12. Okay? Now remember, make sure you only write out the new thing. I'm not dividing by -12. That was already there. This is my new thing that's happening. Okay? So I get m all by itself because these guys cancel out. And then actually what I can do up here is I can make my -12 into a fraction. I can cross cancel by dividing by 2. So I get 1 and I get 6. And then I get 3 times 6 is 18. Oops, made my 8 a little bit funny there. But notice I multiplied a positive by a negative, so my answer is -18. Okay, and again, I can go up here, I can just think to myself logically. -18 divided by -12, I might not be able to do that in my head, but I can go negative divided by negative does give me a positive over here. All right, let's do one more. Okay, so I got a little bit messy. All right, so again, I'm multiplying m by 3 and -3 and 1/3. So I'm going to start by writing out what I have. The steps don't change just because I'm working with fractions. And I'm going to divide by -3 and 1/3. This is my new step. This is the new thing that happened. So what I do to one side, I must do to the other. Now again, like I said on the earlier slide, I personally think it's easier to write divided by on this side this way. So I divide by -3 1/3. This cancels out over here. So I get m equals -5/6. Now, what I can do over here is I can think, well, again, I need to make my mixed numbers into improper fractions. 3 times 3 is 9, plus 1 is 10. So I actually have 10/3. But now what I want to do to divide is I want to multiply by the reciprocal. So my reciprocal becomes 3/10. Now I almost made a classic mistake. I almost forgot the negative. Don't forget the negative. So add that in there. One tip I have when you're doing your lesson, as soon as you start a new line, go back and make sure you included all the negatives that you've had to do. Now, a clue to tell me that I'm doing it right is that things are actually cross-canceling quite nicely. So that's usually an idea that you're doing it correctly. So I get 1 over here, 2 over here, 1 over here, and 2 over here. So I get m equals 1 times 1 is 1, 2 times 2 is 4. I have a negative times a negative, so I end up with a positive because I have the same signs. Okay? So again, feel free to call me if you have any questions. Remember, if you don't understand your corrections, now is the time to ask. Don't leave it for another day. Ask me so that you're not